There's an interesting development in the long-running Leandro school funding lawsuit in North Carolina, and joining us to talk about it is Dr. Terry Stoops. He is director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. Terry, one of the main issues in this case in recent years has been whether the judge who's overseeing this suit would force state lawmakers to pay hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars in new funding on education. We learned something important about that this week. What did we learn?
Well, at a hearing on Tuesday, Judge David Lee said that he was not inclined to compel the General Assembly to spend the money that's been outlined for the items that are outlined in the comprehensive plan that was submitted to the courts by the plaintiffs and the defendants. The plaintiffs and the defendants took what was called the West Ed report, which outlined what those consultants believed to be the essential elements of creating a system of sound basic education in North Carolina, created an 8-year plan, and then submitted it to the court. And they had hoped that Judge Lee was going to submit an order that would require the General Assembly to spend the money. Now, there would be no way to really enforce it, and this would create a separation of powers issue with the legislature and the courts. And that doesn't look like that's going to happen now that Judge Lee urged cooperation between the plaintiffs and the defendants and the General Assembly.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the reasons for the concern is that discussions about resolving this lawsuit have basically involved the initial plaintiffs in the cases, school systems that wanted to see more funding, and then people representing Governor Roy Cooper and the education establishment who also wanted to see more funding, but not involved in any of the discussions were the funders, the General Assembly.
That's right. The General Assembly is not a party to the case, and so that always makes a strange situation with the plaintiffs and defendants talking about spending money, but actually the people that are responsible for spending money, the General Assembly. And the Constitution, by the way, is very clear that the responsibility for collecting taxes, spending taxpayer dollars resides with the General Assembly, was really never at the table. And there was an effort by Senator Deanna Ballard to get Judge Lee to come in and to discuss some of these issues, and Judge Lee declined. But I think what Judge Lee is signaling now is that it's not the judge that should go to the General Assembly and discuss funding priorities related to Leandro, but instead the plaintiffs and the defendants. Now, there is some communication between the defendants and the General Assembly. The defendants are the State Board of Education. So the State Board of Education has been actively collaborating with the General Assembly to discuss Leandro matters, but the plaintiffs certainly haven't. And the plaintiffs in the hearing made it very clear how disappointed they were that Judge Lee wasn't going to issue an order that would try to compel the General Assembly to spend the money, because they have really alienated in a lot of ways the members of the General Assembly. And so it's going to be difficult for the plaintiffs to be able to go now to the General Assembly and try to establish an amicable and working relationship.
So there's a plan that calls for something like $8 billion in new spending over the next 8 years. If the judge is not going to force state lawmakers to spend part or all of that money, what should happen to this report? What is likely to happen to this report? How will things move forward and lead us toward a resolution of this case that's been going on for more than a quarter century?
Gosh, I hope a resolution actually does come someday, because we've been dealing with this case since 1994. But I think the General Assembly is going to take seriously the comprehensive remedial plan that was submitted to the court. I think that there are things in that plan that the General Assembly had already planned to do, such as increasing teacher pay and some of the other measures that are outlined in the report. Now, there is going to be a difference of opinion, and I think the General Assembly is going to look at some of the things in the report and probably decide not to move on some of the recommendations in it. And so the plaintiffs and defendants might have to deal with the situation where the General Assembly is on board for some, but not all of the elements that are outlined in the report. And so how they deal with that is, and how the judge deals with that will really, I think, form the basis of Leandro going forward. Will there be an attempt, for example, the judge to ask the judge to go back and force the General Assembly to do things that weren't in the budget but were included in the plan? It'll be interesting to see where we go from here. To say that the General Assembly is totally opposed to the comprehensive report, I think, is a mistake. They just don't want to be told how to spend the money, and they obviously have their own set of priorities that they're well within their rights to include in a budget or in legislation.
Given where things stand and the statement from Judge David Lee that he has no intention of telling lawmakers how much money they need to spend, should we consider that good news for parents, voters, taxpayers?
This is good news for the North Carolina Constitution, because it's really the constitutional issues of the separation of powers between the judiciary and the General Assembly, the legislature, that was at issue here. And so it looks like that has been preserved. But I think it's also good news for taxpayers who in no way want the courts to tell the legislature how to spend taxpayer money. I think that North Carolinians know that the courts need to stay in their lane and allow the General Assembly to do what the Constitution empowers them to do.
As this case moves forward, we will continue to get updates from Dr. Terry Stoops. He is the director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. Thanks so much, Terry.
Thank you.